which is education and dyspraxia. And again, we're going to get figurative. So let's imagine learning is a kitchen. One person learns by tasting, another by reading the recipe, and a third person by watching a cooking show. But what if the ingredients keep rolling off the counter? The labels, they're smudged, and the utensils are all in the wrong order. That's the educational experience, or that could be the educational experience with someone with dyspraxia. And when it comes to education, there are two primary camps that emerge: the learning style camp and the multisensory camp. Let's briefly define that. The learning style camp suggests that students learn best when taught according to their preferred style or their preferred learning style, which can be visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. While the idea sounds intuitive, the truth may be more complex. Because when we go to the studies that have been conducted to prove whether learning styles are effective, the answer is the following. And while there have been some small studies that suggest mild support, large-scale meta-analysis finds that there is no significant advantage within the camp that promotes learning styles. So then this coordinates a question: is there enough evidence? And the answer would probably be not really. But from this perspective, we don't have enough studies. But then let's go to the other hand, or the other camp, which is the multi-sensory approach. And this is where teaching methods, they're promoted to engage multiple senses simultaneously. And this would appear to show more promise. So for learners with dyspraxia who benefit from structure, repetition, and active engagement, this approach is often far more effective. But here's an important point: there is no one size that fits all. Let's explain that with a visual example. What works for Sally may not work for John, and what works for John may not work for Lisa, and vice versa. So this means it's important that the educational system is not lazy when it comes to empowering people with dyspraxia. Remember, we defined empowering earlier, or we defined what empowerment meant earlier. So of course, there is some context here, so let me explain. The first thing is that not every school is the same. For example, the education system differs from one school to another. Let's do a brief breakdown. So school A may be great at identifying and supporting dyspraxia, but school B may be good at identifying dyspraxia, but not be as good as providing solutions. And school C may struggle in both areas. Obviously, this is a very basic narrative bias, but the point is, there are many different moving parts, and there are other nuances as well. For example, you can have great educational institutions with bad teachers, and you can have bad educational institutions with great teachers. And of course, there's more questions to ask. What is a great teacher? What is the distinction between a bad teacher, a good teacher, and a great teacher? And of course, there are other variables when we're looking at, the current economic situations and the individual budgets of each school. And in Britain, of course, you have the contrast between public and private schools. So another question here, when it comes to dyspraxia, is that what do we need to make education better for people with dyspraxia and for people that are neurodivergent? Because clearly we need to make it better for people that are neurotypical, we need to make it better for people that are neurodivergent, and we also need to make it better for people that have dyspraxia. And no matter what is the context, and clearly there is a level of context and there's a level of nuance, there is a need for flexibility, there is a need for patience, and there is a need for creativity. From my perspective, teachers must be, and I'm using this term loosely, educational architects, designing environments that allow every learner to build with the tools that they can hold. Diagnosis, why it's often missed. So let's get figurative again. Trying to identify dyspraxia can feel like searching for an invisible needle in a haystack, especially when no one even told you to look for it in the first place. Considering this, why is dyspraxia so frequently missed? It's a valid question. And there may be several reasons for this. Economics can obviously play a major role. Why? Because testing is expensive and not all families have access to resources or insurance coverage depending on where you live. Schools are often under-resourced and overstretched, with too few specialists to go around. And many educators and healthcare providers haven't received specific training to recognize neurodevelopmental differences like dyspraxia. Instead, they may misinterpret the signs. A child struggling to tie their shoelaces might be labeled as lazy. A student who can't write neatly is called careless. And a teenager who forgets steps in a sequence is seen as unfocused or distracted. This lack of social awareness means that many people reach adulthood without a diagnosis, left to navigate the world without an accurate map of their own brain. Often the diagnosis doesn't come until college or the workplace, when the pressure to perform independently becomes too much. And that's when the cracks start to show and when many finally seek answers. And it shouldn't be this way, and it doesn't have to be this way. Early diagnosis can change lives. The sooner someone understands how their brain works, the better they can adapt, the better they can advocate for themselves, and hopefully the better they'll be able to find resources and access support. To get there, or maybe we should ask the question, how do we get there? Well, institutions need to sharpen their radar. We need to train teachers and healthcare professionals to spot the early signs. We need improved public health screening and affordable, accessible assessments. Clearer referral pathways must be built so that no child gets lost in the system. And above all, we need to talk about dyspraxia more. And when we say more, well, in what environment do we need to talk about dyspraxia? Well, I would argue we need to talk about it at home, we need to talk about it in the classrooms, online, and in everyday life. And of course, awareness is the first step towards action. And here's some questions to consider with regards to this. Have you ever seen signs of dyspraxia in someone you know, but didn't recognize them at the time? And what would it look like if every school had access to a dyspraxia-trained specialist? How can we make diagnosis more equitable and accessible for everyone? And finally, why do you think society is quicker to recognize some neurodivergent traits over others?